You know, I think a lot about the kind of person who is taken seriously. Normally, they have like a big name or a big office that they hold, and to some extent, it makes sense because if they're doing the big job, then surely you owe it to them to take them seriously. The thing is that doing this can lead to some interesting edge cases. What if the person doing the big job isn't someone you take seriously or think is legitimate? Or what if the person you think should have the big job is just kind of a disaster? It's like the nicest way I can put it. That last question is answered almost all the time in Britain. With a cavalcade of clowns being taken seriously. Sometimes it's just a bit of fun, like the subject of this video, because I have had a pretty weird past few weeks, and you know what? Returning with something a bit dumb suits me, I guess. But other times, this leads to Liz Truss, who was the subject of the last video of this type I did. There's something odd about watching someone, especially someone who should know better, treat an obviously ridiculous person like they're a titan of their chosen field. You see it in the way a lot of the press treated Elon Musk, or in the way that we had to suffer through a series of acts that made Boris Johnson look like a Churchillian statesman, which, to be fair, given how much of a shit show Churchill actually was, may not be the most inappropriate comparison, to be fair. But I'm not talking about either of those. Instead, I want to reach into the distant past of 2016, where for 3 months we had to pretend one of the strangest people to ever go for a top job in British politics wasn't a guy who went around the country making dick jokes and who failed to give away free ice cream. Instead, he was the man who was going to save the Labour Party from oblivion by offering one of the most objectively ridiculous pitches of all time. This video isn't about a guy who was an obvious clown. I mean, it's mostly about that, but it's about how no one is really able to understand who their opponent is anymore. There's always endless talk about how the left doesn't understand or get the center or the right, and maybe we don't, and maybe I don't care about that, to be honest, and maybe I should care about it. But when you look at case studies like the one we're looking at today, you do have to wonder if the center understands anything or anyone outside of itself. Friends, it's time to reacquaint ourselves with a man who's actually got everything he ever wanted out of British politics. You know, you do have to give people credit when they get what they want out of something. You know, yeah, that's what he did. And the thing about that is, just as we live under Liz Truss's shadow, we live under his shadow. We're going to be learning about Mr. Whippy himself, Owen Smith. But before we get into all of that, I just want to say, if you like the videos, subscribe. It's the best way to support the channel. Like the videos, drop a comment, talk about what's on the floor mirror. Ask me what's in that cardboard box. Go on, ask me. I would love to tell someone that story. I'm begging you to ask me about it. Okay, but with all of that out of the way, let's just try and make our way through this mess. Owen Smith did not emerge fully formed on the day that he challenged Jeremy Corbyn for the leadership of the Labour Party. You'd be forgiven for thinking he was, because essentially no one outside Westminster would have heard of him. Part of that is because, frankly, he's not a very interesting guy. I mean, his dad, Guy Smith, was Raymond Williams' biographer, and that's kind of interesting and kind of fits into a pattern of all these kind of interesting people having extremely boring kids. But also, people just have better things to do in their life than to know who the shadow work and pension secretary is. It's just true. Maybe that's bad, but it's true. Being a boring person is not the greatest crime ever committed by a politician. It's not even in the top 50% of awful things politicians have done, so why bring it up at all? Because boring in the minds of a not insignificant number of political commentators, is not just a good thing for a politician to be, but what politics as a whole should be. Excitement, particularly excitement among the public, for something they don't understand or like, is suspicious, a sign that something somewhere has gone wrong. I remember in 2016, Donald Trump would constantly talk about government that would make your head spin. And I remember thinking, that sounds terrible. Because at the time, my vague notion of what the government should do is just do whatever it is that needs to be done to make the country less of a wasteland. I was 22, what did you expect? There was not any chance of fully formed communist thought at that point. My point is that while being boring isn't great if you want to be, say, a performing artist of some sort, it's basically forgivable if what you're trying to be is a politician. The trouble is that people often aren't boring, and Owen Smith, like all good comic book characters, which is what he is really in all of this, has an origin story. It's important to situate Owen Smith into the particular political context he emerged in. In 2002, he was a special advisor, or SPAD, for a Labour MP. And this was really typical of the time. The SPAD to MP to cabinet or shadow cabinet pipeline is well established. In fact, it wasn't uncommon in the 2000s for competition to get selected as a Labour candidate in certain seats to come down to two different people's SPADs, which of course made these selections pretty partisan and a proxy for increasing the MP or their faction's influence, I'm sure that is a perfectly healthy environment and definitely did not lead to problems later. We have Special Advisor Owen Smith, and then we have, let me just check what I've got here. Lobbyist for Pfizer, Owen Smith. He was the head of policy and government relations, while also running for the Labour Party in 2006 in the Blaenau Gwent by-election. I'm going to apologise to any Welsh people who watch this. I do not speak Welsh, sorry. Where he was humiliated by a local party called Blaenau Gwent People's Voice in a historically safe Labour seat. To date, he is the second person ever to lose it, and in a trend that may well be repeating itself, the one poll that we have for the constituency had Owen Smith winning, but he underperformed it by 10%. To be fair, the one source I have for this poll is Wikipedia. I tried to find the original poll, but it appears the German company who did it has been acquired by YouGov, and they haven't bothered to keep an archive or something. I just can't find the original thing, is what I'm trying to get at here. And it seems to have been unremarked upon by the press, but it's still kind of funny. A fun fact for you all, and kind of an unnecessary drive-by, but on the day of that by-election, future Labour Austerian politician and admirer of Nazi sympathiser Nancy Astor, Rachel Reeves, came fourth in the Bromley and Chislehurst by-election, falling from her second-place finish in 2005 behind the Lib Dems and Nigel Farage. Wonder if the quality of the candidate may have had an impact on the long-term future of the UK. Who can say? Who can say? We're just having fun. Regardless, this is rather typical of a politician in the UK. You take your lumps in a by-election or in a seat you don't think you're likely to win, then you get to be an MP eventually if you play the game, and Owen Smith, he played the game. He became MP for Pontypridd in 2010, and that's when we finally see him make a media impact in his own right beyond losing a high-profile election. Owen Smith MP makes his first impact in ITV News Wales with a very complimentary piece titled The Rapid Rise of Owen Smith, which, could be referring to something else based on what happens later on in this story. In a lot of ways, the article itself is somewhat unremarkable, like everything about the man. It is interesting, though, who gets labelled as a rising star and who's just an unremarkable drone? The guy had been an MP for just 2 years, and yet he's a rising star because he's Shadow Wales Secretary? I'm not just dunking on Wales here. I have nothing but respect for languages that have loads of W's and L's in them. But it's kind of considered a third-rate job, and that's more out of disrespect that the political class has for Wales than anything actually about Wales. And that being said, yes, it was kind of remarkable at the time to have that kind of role in 2 years, but why write about him in such glowing terms? Remember, at the time, Labour was reeling from a pretty severe defeat in 2010, and there was at least a slight realization that you needed some new blood. And if you have to praise someone, the guy who was a BBC producer sure seems like a convenient guy for ITV to write an article about. I'm not suggesting foul play or anything, just that it's easier to say nice things about your friends. He's also mentioned in this article about the Politician of the Year award. And yes, that's a thing. And again, it's about his rise to the shadow cabinet, which I find curious as a concept, right? Like, why are we having award shows for politicians? And of course, it always ends up being the politicians who are friendly with the press who get mentioned. But then something interesting happens. Owen Smith disappears. I don't mean he literally got Thanos snapped out of existence, but most media mentions of him are just, Wales secretary criticised for not kissing a sheep on the mouth. And obviously the person criticising him for not kissing a sheep on the mouth is Owen Smith. In other words, he just seems to quietly get on with his job. And then something terrible happened. Well, for Owen Smith at least, because the Labour Party lost the 2015 election. And I think this is one of those events that's sort of forgotten about, because it was a genuine shock that the Tories not only remained the largest party, but had actually managed to get a majority. Ed Miliband had done everything the Labour Party was told it had to do to win power. They compromised, they embraced right-wing narratives on immigration, and gave up on the policies that initially gave them a huge lead over the Conservatives. It was just, they bent over backwards for the right wing in this country, and they still lost. Losing when you've done everything you're told would lead you to winning is a bit disorientating. I will concede that. A lot of members of the party before that election were pretty fed up, apparently, with making these compromises, because what's the point of compromising to win if you don't get to win because your leader is made fun of for eating a bacon sandwich funny? Our protagonist was actually mentioned, somewhat hilariously given the field that attempted to succeed Ed Miliband, as a potential successor to him. Why? Well, according to Stephen Bush, the notorious faux curious Blairite, the pros were quietly impressive, untainted by the failures of both the last Labour government and the wider Miliband project. The general election went particularly badly in Wales, and he could be instrumental in the fight back. Now, in fairness, he does call him the long shot, which is fair, but we talk about things aging like milk. I want you to keep the term quietly impressive in your mind, because that's going to be particularly put to the test as we go through this. So here's the fun thing. A long shot did end up succeeding Ed Miliband, but it wasn't Owen Smith, who didn't really mount any kind of serious attempt at a campaign, but instead it was, according to some, the most evil man to ever be the leader of a major party. If you want a small glimpse of what that resulted in without the Owen Smith bit, then I did a whole video about it, but a lot of Owen Smith's colleagues did not take the news particularly well, refusing to work under their new leader who emerged seemingly from nowhere. Owen Smith took on the job of Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, which isn't a glamorous position, but was important since a big break with those past 5 years of 2010 and 2015 was moving away from austerity. For him to be in that position, I have to concede a little tiny bit maybe and say he probably did seem to care about that issue. Not enough to vote against the welfare bill that arguably propelled the bastard man to the leadership, but enough to swallow his pride, having seen his, probably more likely his political allies, getting crushed by him. And boy, were they crushed. The bastard man got 59.5%, and it'll be worth remembering that percentage, because my guess is it might get a higher one next time. Who knows? I need to explain what happened after this, because you might think, well, the guy won a crushing victory and Owen Smith just faded into the background, just kind of doing his job, which he did. And there are a couple of notable things along the way that we'll talk about, so we can just skip to the bit where he's talking about the size of his dick now, right? Wrong. We have to do a little bit more work before we get to the fun stuff. There's something we need to understand about the short period between September 2015 and June 2016, and yes, it really was that short. No one in the press and very few in Parliament thought that the bastard man Jeremy Corbyn was a legitimate leader, so they were looking for any old excuse to try and force him out. First, it was expected that he'd flame out at Prime Minister's questions when the MP of then 32 years managed to not shit himself publicly during a spectacle he's observed literally hundreds of times. They moved on. If he could handle Parliament reasonably well, then maybe there'd be a flashpoint. So a lot of MPs decided to vote for military action in Syria specifically to undermine him. People don't like it when I say that, and they go, oh, but maybe they sincerely felt that this was the right thing to do, and it's really flippant and rude of you to say this when they're talking about lives that are in the balance. But come on, you're telling me the press hailed one of the most ahistorical speeches ever given in the Commons by Hilary Benn because they didn't think this entire, theatrical act was an attempt to undermine him? Please, come on. Even the voting was part of this act, and you just need to get real about that, to be honest. In any case, our hero, Mr. 29 Inches, voted against the intervention. Do I think this was some cynical play in the game to launch his platform for leader? At the time, I didn't think so. And if I'm being honest, if I criticize people when they vote for war and I criticize them when they vote against war, it does kind of look like I'm just not taking yes for an answer. That being said, maybe there is something to the idea he was faking it. I don't know. I can't look into the guy's soul to know for sure what he was thinking and how sincere he was. But I have cause to think that perhaps this wasn't just a sincere anti-interventionist stance. It also didn't work as a flashpoint because Jeremy Corbyn just let MPs vote how they wanted on the intervention. Perhaps it just kicked the can down the road, but at the time you have to understand that there was a real sense that the whole thing could come crashing down at any moment. It's hard to remember how fragile and surreal this all was at the time. We got used to it after 4 years, but it really was. Before we get to the last big moment for him before he launched his challenge, another opportunity emerged. A by-election where the press talked up the idea of losing their working class vote to UKIP, which at the time was very in fashion. Of course, any reasonable look at the seat's previous results would have meant that this idea was dismissed out of hand, at least as a proving ground for that. A lot of press hype later, and Labour increased its vote share and lead over UKIP. Womp womp. The aftermath of this is when Owen Swift makes his last big impression, a favourable write-up by George Eaton in The New Statesman, where he drops the bomb that he'd like to be Labour leader someday. Now, I'm not saying that it's weird that he answers a question when it's asked, although actually, to be fair, for a politician, that is maybe a little bit odd, actually. But why is the question being asked? My feeling is that it's asked because no one in the press considered the current situation legitimate or sustainable and thought it'd end as soon as people got bored of it. It's also a little convenient that he voted in line with the party leadership on its biggest divergence with the bulk of its parliamentary party, and Parliament itself, and the press, and then get this, I won't say glowing, but shimmering write-up. It just seems weird to me, given how spiteful and petty these people tend to be. Finally, we get to the excuse to try to oust the guy Owen Smith was declaring his loyalty to in that very write-up. You know it, you love it. It's the 2016 referendum on leaving the European Union. I really hate talking about it, almost because it's such an EU flag-brained thing to do, but it was the pretext here. But you also might spot an issue when I explain what happened exactly. Here's the way it went. The Labour Party's position was to support remaining in the EU, so they made a Labour Remain campaign led by Alan Johnson, who dresses up as a snake on TV these days, I guess. I don't know what he's up to. The leadership were also expected to endorse and campaign along the party line, which they did. But the country voted to leave, so clearly this was the leadership's fault, right? Even if you don't know much about UK politics, that's a pretty flimsy pretext, like flimsy enough that even Boeing would think twice before using it on their planes. It's such a narrow way to view how that referendum went down, and assumes that Labour were the only party that had a Remain policy where a significant number of their voters voted leave because they have millions of voters, and among millions of people, some divergent opinion is going to exist, right? I can only imagine. So here's the thing. A similar proportion of Lib Dem and SNP supporters voted leave. Well, at least a significant portion of them. So their leaders should have been replaced, right? Clearly they didn't care enough about it. Or how about the Remain-supporting pig-fucking Prime Minister whose party supporters voted mostly to leave? And who called the referendum in the first place? Might he be to blame? Or the guy who was in charge of the Labour Remain campaign who barely made any media impression? I mean, if we're saying Labour are apparently the only people who can affect it, maybe the guy who was invisible is more responsible than the guy who was visible. I don't know. Really, the main incident they point to as evidence is an appearance on The Last Leg, which is an incredibly boring comedy talk show where Jeremy Corbyn gave the EU a 7 out of 10, which is an incredibly generous mark, if you ask me, for a protectionist trade bloc that deliberately creates the conditions for refugees to drown. And crucially, it was a critically supportive view that came across as more honest for a long time Eurosceptic than blind cheerleading would ever have come across as. It's also a bizarre premise. Think about this. Jeremy Corbyn was simultaneously so electorally toxic that he couldn't possibly win a general election, but was also so in command of Labour supporters and public opinion that he could have changed the result of a referendum if he just, I don't know, tried a little harder or lied? Let's call this what this was. They were looking for an excuse, and they got bored waiting. It's funny, as I was writing this, I realized this, right? The guy who's supposed to be the main character so far is always kind of a background character or second choice, and that continues here because the first big beast to challenge the bastard man was Angela Eagle, which in retrospect seems kind of laughable given the spectacle of journalists fleeing her launch to go cover something more interesting. There is a reason why some felt it had to be her. Firstly, there was kind of this consensus that it was a tiny bit embarrassing for Labour to have not had a female leader at the time. So people were generally on the next one has to be a woman train, which got derailed here long before Keir Starmer re-derailed it some way down the road, and in actually kind of a similar way. The second reason was that one of the media confections of the time, and believe me, there were a lot, including some that would actually stick through sheer brute force eventually, unfortunately, was that Jeremy Corbyn was a sexist. So why push that line, and what was the basis for believing that? As far as I can tell, there were 3 reasons. First reason was he spoke positively about the idea of women's-only train carriages as a potential measure to reduce harassment of women in public. The second reason was that some of his most vocal critics were women. A good example of this is Jess Phillips, who would get told to shut the fuck up by his supporters on Twitter, which had more to do with her putting on a false working class facade and pretending to speak for everyone who'd ever lived in a council house than her being a woman. But I guess I can kind of see it, but also, is he really responsible for everything everyone does online ever? I don't think that's entirely reasonable. But the third reason, and possibly the most ridiculous one, is that they pushed this narrative because of an unsourced, unconfirmed, anonymous anecdote from an unauthorized biography of Jeremy Corbyn, which was so ridiculous that the press never brought it up again after trying to gin up outrage the first time. I'll try and remember exactly which of the unauthorized biographies this was in, but there were so many unauthorized biographies of this guy with so many weird stories. I'm not sure this one was from an unauthorized biography, but there was the Jeremy Corbyn killed my hamster with a pogo stick newspaper article, which was incredible. But anyway, it stands to reason that when you combine this guy as a sexist with the next leader should be a woman, that a woman is clearly the right, aesthetic direction to go in. That's probably just vibes based alone, probably what you should be doing, right? Only she got fewer nominations than Owen Smith, and she withdrew. And I have thoughts about why this may have happened. My main one is that the Parliamentary Labour Party, they're really small C conservative, and they keep falling for the white guy in a suit. Even though in functional terms, the women who put themselves forward are basically indistinguishable from the men who bested them. Whether it's Angela Eagle and Owen Smith, or Lisa Nandy and Keir Starmer, they're the fucking same. They're the same pieces of shit. Maybe there's another sexism problem actually going on. I don't know. Who's to say? Also, he did do a whole song and dance about being the normal candidate with a wife and 3 kids, which has this unfortunate connotation given that Angela Eagle is a lesbian who doesn't have kids, or didn't have kids at the time, I don't know if she does now, which is an incredibly ungenerous interpretation and way to read that, but it is a bit suboptimal in terms of presenting yourself as the serious potential leader of a left-of-centre party. Whether him being normal was what pulled the Parliamentary Labour Party to him or not, it's somewhat a case of beginning as he meant to continue. It's also weird because the incumbent had a wife and 3 kids. It's just a deeply strange way to try and justify yourself and introduce yourself to the public. That's how our guy became the candidate. The champion of moderation, the anti-Zinch. He would scale back the change and be a slick media operator who would prove that a more considered approach would be appealing and not a total fiasco with a series of deeply embarrassing public appearances. Except that's not really what happened, is it? I need to explain the exact situation here. An overwhelmingly popular leader within his party, who most people thought was still overwhelmingly popular within that party, is being challenged for the party leadership because a group of people fundamentally are bored that he's impeding their careers. How do you get rid of him in a system where people who still like him get to vote for him and make up most of the people voting? Well, what if he wasn't on the ballot in the first place? Challengers needed to get nominations to be on the ballot. Why shouldn't the incumbent leader? That avenue of attack was closed off quite quickly by the executive committee of the party. So what's the next plan? Make it prohibitively expensive to be a member of the party and cut off when you would be eligible to vote. This is the first part of just not understanding what's going on. The bastard man did really well among longer term members when he first got elected. So this attempt to gerrymander, and I think that is the right word for what this is, was doomed to fail. So with all that being the case, what's left to try? Given the layout of the selectorate, which is that it's mostly people who seem to like this guy, Owen Smith has 2 hopes. One, demotivate his opponent's supporters with a series of wedge issues and with a full court press saying that he was just hopeless and that supporting someone who wants to do good things is bad or racist or sexist or childish. The second hope is actually constructing a coherent policy platform that took the desires of a significant portion of his opponents seriously and marrying that with a level of media handling and quiet competence that we'd expect from someone who is basically invisible aside from that specific praise of him. Perhaps I've tipped my hand a little with the way I've described those two, but you might be able to guess how this went. In a word, poorly. but this is a YouTube video, so maybe I need to expand on that thought a bit. Normally, if I was talking about someone's campaign to become a leader, I talk about what their offer was in policy terms, and that would be most of what would happen here. Instead, I need to talk about Owen Smith's penis. I promise this is not just me veering off into nonsense, as much as I think the outcome was pretty much guaranteed from the start. This was remarkable. Like, it feels like a fever dream. Before we talk about that, though, I really am just, like, teasing you all now. Ironically with Owen Smith's penis, but, like, I promise you we're getting there. Before we talk about that, I just want to establish what I think happened. I think that Owen Smith believed certain things, and we can talk about where he may have acquired those beliefs, but he acted on those beliefs that were probably going to make him even more doomed than he already was. Those things he believed about the people he'd need to either demotivate or win over was, 1, they're sexist, or to use the parlance of the time, brocialists, which is odd given that among the general electorate, one of the most common types of Corbyn voter, at least according to the polling data, was a woman between the ages of 18 and 24, which stereotypically are not going to be supremely cool with the sexism. 2, they're fundamentally stupid or easy to dupe with promises that you don't intend to keep. 3, they're more focused on a personality than on the actual policies. 4, they're possibly a little bit racist. And 5, they're absurdly dovish and just want to hear that you'll not do wars over and over again and you'll just negotiate with whoever you need to negotiate with. Where would you have to look to get that impression? Mostly the British press. It's worth noting that Owen Smith did work in the British press, and they did try to inflate his stature whenever they mentioned him. Not saying anything else about it, it's just interesting to me. So what about his dick? Well, imagine, if you will, one of the key press narratives about your opponent is that he and his supporters are sexist. What would you do? Would you A, evidence the claim that they're driven by sexism and try to present an inclusive set of policies designed to tackle gender inequality, which admittedly would look a bit ironic coming from Owen Smith, given that he just sort of barged a woman out of the way to be on the ballot. But setting that aside, or B, when a member of an audience at your rally asks if they can ask you a personal question, you point at your crotch and say, 29 inches. The sensible among you would think, of course a quietly impressive and competent politician like Owen Smith, and like the press suggested Owen Smith was, would pick A and construct a coherent narrative and all of that stuff, right? That's what he'd do. Well, in a shocking twist, he in fact bragged about his 29-inch dick. This is incredible for a couple of reasons. Firstly, British people love to make themselves feel better by pointing at American politicians and saying, wow, thank God we're not like them. And one of those big Donald Trump 2016 moments I remember was him bragging about his dick size on stage. So, you know, that's fun. A fun little bit of convergence. We're not so different, it turns out. The second reason is that Owen Smith was to laddish banter what Hollywood Undead is to new metal. Sorry, that might feel like an unfair drive-by on people who are just doing, like, music. But it's true. The wave of boys will be boys and laddish jokes had, if not passed, pretty much was on the way out. Sure, at the age of 22, which I was at the time, wow, such a long time ago, I may have made those kinds of jokes, but also I wasn't trying to be leader of a major political party while claiming my opponent was sexist. But maybe this is just a joke, right? And I'm being a hypocrite. If someone I liked made the joke, maybe I'd find it funny. Fine, maybe so. But there was also this bizarre exchange where he assured us that his dick works completely fine and he's never had to take Viagra, which, you know, I find to be completely believable and requiring no further questions. The guy says his dick works and it's massive, fine. Cool, but it does make you seem like kind of a jackass if you're suggesting that you're not only the right person to lead one of the largest political parties in Europe, but also become the leader of the UK. Okay, given who's been the leader of the UK recently, maybe that's not the best point of comparison, but you take my point. These weren't the only weirdly out-of-date laddish things that Owen Smith did. There was the time he bragged about beating off hundreds of men in order to get his wife. I know he didn't say beat off, but what I said was way funnier for me. The weirder part of this anecdote is that he cited it as evidence that he was a winner. I'm all for using the most tangentially transferable experiences you have to try and get yourself a better job. If you think being a Dungeons & Dragons DM means you have great organizational skills because it's impossible to get the party to actually show up on the day to play the game, then, that's great. I struggle to see how being on the Sigma male grind set with seducing your wife with your 29-inch cock translates to can win an election. God, I've just laved the idea of Owen Smith's Sigma grind set. And I do not like where that's going, so we're just going to move on. And I promise you this is the least consequential and last time I will mention anyone's penis in this video. Probably... I can possibly make that promise, but given all of this backdrop, this is made even funnier. Take a look at this campaign bus and pay attention to the crotch region. Doesn't that look awfully like he's getting tossed off on the side of his own bus? I mean, given the UK elected Boris Johnson, maybe a laddish guy talking about his giant dong means he really would have won, but really, this guy's already crumbled to dust because he lives perpetually in a National Lampoon film. He also said that Labour should have been smashing Theresa May onto her heels, which went down extremely poorly given that it's arguably graphic language and violent language used about a woman, and given the, whole is Labour sexist atmosphere of the time, he was forced to apologise for this comment. And while I do think part of this was people playing a bit of a game to twist his words to make it sound way worse than it is, if your pitch is, I'm the slick communications guy, that's me, you need to actually demonstrate some slick communications and not have your words twisted so easily that you end up apologizing for it. I want us to cast our minds back to 2016. Do you remember what the most pressing foreign policy issue of the time was? I've mentioned it already. It was Syria and its civil war. At the time, there was a tension between people who wanted to minimize the chaos and deaths and multiple crises by engaging with as many political factions as possible to try and reduce the amount of fighting, and then there were people who wanted to bomb the fuck out of the entire country. Now, across all of these positions, there was a consensus, which was that ISIS, remember them? They were such an extreme part of the conflict that bringing them to the table was impossible. It's true, there's an understanding of conflict and conflict resolution that means that you tend to see leftists and people who actually observe material reality, which is mostly leftists, call for negotiated solutions and ceasefires as a way to immediately stop killing. The thing is, ISIS wanted to establish a global caliphate with an extremely conservative interpretation of Sharia law governing it. You can't exactly negotiate down from there and have them as part of a transitional government in Syria. As funny as the idea of an ISIS Minister of Finance seems, it's just not a thing that can happen. This is all build up to me telling you this serious, real thing that happened, and I promise you this isn't a parody. Owen Smith wanted to get ISIS round the negotiating table. Why would he say this absurd thing that got him made fun of by everyone? Because he wasn't targeting a real, complex, thinking person. He was targeting a press caricature of the kind of person he needed to win over. This is straight up the kind of thing you'd say if you thought the person you were trying to persuade was fucking stupid. In that spirit, when you actually looked at his policy platform, he fell into the classic trap that centrists always fall into, which is saying that I'm that person, but I'm going to do less than them. For example, take his British New Deal, a policy of injecting £200 billion into the economy, which was almost exactly half of what his opponent was proposing to inject into the economy. Why would people who think that there needs to be large-scale investment into the British economy go for the guy offering less? What's the coherent narrative here? If you think there needs to be investment, why are you offering half? How do you explain that to people? And there wasn't really much explanation. It went pretty much unexplained beyond some vague mumbling about credibility and stuff like that. but the position wasn't credible. Or take his position on 0-hour contracts, that workers should have a guaranteed minimum number of hours of work. That's cool, but it's pretty much identical to what his opponent was offering, except in one crucial way. Owen Smith suggested the minimum could be 1 hour, leading to him looking like a dickhead again. For those wondering, a 1-hour contract on minimum wage in 2016 would increase your income by £7.20, which at the time could have bought you a couple of pints at a student bar, I guess. So, you know, it's not nothing, but it's not exactly the basis around which to plan your life, is it? The fact that policy took such a back seat in this contest really ought to tell you how premature and how doomed to fail this whole thing was. In the debates, there was basically no argument about the policies of the incumbent being bad. It was just that he was personally some kind of an asshole. An idea that dissolved on contact when you watched him, right? Oh, and he tried to get the incumbent to accept the position of president of the Labour Party, a position that did not exist, and that if he'd won, he'd have no incentive to create. One last thing that I need to tell you, and then we can finally get to the inevitable conclusion of this, which is that he held a rally where he tried to give away free ice cream, and managed to produce this picture of himself, which is just a masterpiece of... Yeah, this is a slick media operator right here, if I've ever seen one. And he also failed to give away free ice cream, consistently drawing much smaller crowds than his opponent did. I mean, shit, it turns out he tried this in the city I live in, and if I'd known, I'd have taken the tram to get a free ice cream. Accept the ice cream and vote Corbyn. God, that would have been a funny thing to sort of make a slogan out of at the time. This all leads us to the obvious conclusion of this circus. Owen Smith lost. He actually lost so badly that the bastard man increased his vote share. He crumbled under not even like scrutiny, just like publicity. To quote a Labour source, people were embarrassed by all the gaffes during the leadership campaign. And really, this is the part where I'm offering my thoughts on it. They really should have been, right? The sad thing about all of this is that he really got the last laugh. While he's exiling himself to Australia to work for Big Pharma again, which, you know, I guess old habits die hard, the people who pushed him into publicly humiliating himself have got absolutely everything they wanted. Another partisan of mediocrity is in charge of the Labour Party, a gaff-prone, plain, white guy who took over a contest where people generally agreed the successor should have been a woman, and who doesn't really have any original ideas of their own. In a way, we're going to be living under the shadow of Owen Smith's 29-inch cock long into the 2020s, and possibly beyond. This is it. Mediocrity is here to stay, and it's gonna suck. So yeah, that's possibly the most farcical politician of the 2010s in Britain. And because the press can't help but take this guy kind of seriously, and this type of guy kind of seriously, he kind of won. That's kind of shitty to think about. I need to thank my partner who proofread this script, and Emma who made the graphics. You know, it's a great thumbnail. Maybe a little Owen Smith heavy for my tastes, but hey, that's just sort of how it goes down. I need to also thank the patrons and the YouTube member. So special shout out to Drone from Kujio, Kazi Shida, and John N, who are the top tier patrons over on Patreon. And a special shout out to our lone YouTube member, Nada Jiwa. Thank you to them for supporting the channel. If you would like to support the channel, patreon.com/SKTheCrusader for the Patreon. There's a big old join button on the channel, and also subscribe and like the video and leave a comment if you liked this. This was kind of a spiritual successor to the Liz Truss video. No, we'll play around with it and just see if people like having a sort of mini series on ridiculous British politicians. We'll see how that plays out. But in the meantime, I've got to go, and well, as I'm recording this, I have to go edit this video right away. And yeah, I'll get out of your way and let you get on with your day or evening or whatever. Anyway, peace. See you later.